Don't worry, sons. I'll help you, Grandma said. 2,000 Hell's Angels, wrote in her honor. The clouds came in low over Miller's Creek that evening, rolling across the ridge like they had somewhere important to be. Ruth Callahan stood in the doorway of Callahan's Hardware and watched them gather, gray and heavy, swallowing the last orange light of the sun. She sighed and turned the sign on the door from open to closed. The bell above the frame gave its same tired jingle, the one it had given every night for 43 years. Frank had hung that bell himself, back when the store was new and the town was full of young families and hope. Ruth ran her fingers over the old brass, worn smooth from years of hands pushing through the door. "Storm's coming, Frank," she said out loud, the way she often did when the shop was empty. Talking to a dead man didn't make her crazy. It just made her lonely. And there was a difference, even if nobody else seemed to understand it. She moved down the narrow aisles, straightening a row of paint cans that didn't need straightening, checking the lock on the register that was already locked. The shelves were thinner than they used to be. Fewer customers meant fewer orders, and fewer orders meant gaps on the shelves that looked like missing teeth. Miller's Creek wasn't dying, not exactly, but it wasn't living much either. The gas station 3 miles down had closed last spring. The diner on Main Street only opened on weekends now. Young people left for the cities and didn't come back, and the old folks who stayed were slowly disappearing too, one funeral at a time. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now, back to the story. Ruth had thought about closing the store more than once. But then she'd remember Frank's hands on these same shelves, stocking nails and paint and rope, whistling some tune she could never remember the name of. Closing the store would mean closing the last piece of him she had left. So she kept the lights on, even when the register barely covered the electric bill. She wiped down the counter with a rag. Slow circles, thinking about her boys. David hadn't called in 3 months, not since Easter, and even then it had been short, clipped, more obligation than conversation. "How are you, Mom?" "Good, good. Well, I've got a meeting. Talk soon?" Talk soon. Ruth had learned not to hold her breath on those 2 words. Her younger boy, Tommy, had passed 6 years back. Car accident on Route 9, the same road that ran past the shop's front window. Some nights, when the wind was right, she thought she could still hear his laugh carried on it. She missed him something fierce, a missing that never really faded, just changed shape over the years, softened at the edges like an old photograph. Ruth reached the front window and looked out at the sky again. The clouds were darker now, pressing down over the ridge like a lid on a pot about to boil. A distant rumble of thunder rolled through the valley. She could smell the rain coming. That mineral, electric smell that always meant business. "Storm's gonna be a bad one," she murmured, pulling her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. She thought about calling David tonight, just to hear his voice. Just to ask about the grandkids she barely knew anymore, the ones who probably didn't remember what her hugs felt like. But then she thought about how the conversation would go, the careful politeness, the distance in his voice that had nothing to do with the miles between them. Maybe tomorrow, she always told herself. Maybe tomorrow. She flipped off the lights in the back room, the shelves falling into shadow. The old floorboards creaked under her feet as she made her way to the front door, keys jingling in her hand. Outside, the first fat drops of rain began to spatter against the sidewalk, dark spots blooming on the concrete like ink on paper. Ruth stepped out, locked the door behind her, and tested the handle twice, an old habit Frank used to tease her about. "Ruth, this ain't Fort Knox," he'd say, and she'd just shrug and check it anyway. The rain started coming down harder now, drumming against the tin awning above the entrance. Ruth hurried around to the side stairs that led up to her small apartment above the shop, her cardigan pulled tight, her keys already out for the second door. Once inside, she set the kettle on the stove and pulled her old photo album down from the shelf, the leather cover soft and cracked with age. She settled into her chair by the window, the rain now hammering steadily on the roof above her, and opened the album to a page of two little boys, gap-toothed and grinning, sitting on Frank's shoulders in the front yard of a house that didn't exist anymore. The kettle had long gone cold on the stove when Ruth drifted off in her chair, the photo album still open on her lap, Frank's young face smiling up at her in black and white. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm against the window, the kind of sound that used to lull her to sleep even as a young bride, back when storms meant nothing more than a good excuse to stay in bed a little longer. She wasn't sure what woke her first, the thunder or the pounding. It came again, hard and frantic, rattling up through the floorboards of the shop below. Not the low rumble of the storm, not a branch scraping against the siding. This was fists, human fists, beating against wood with a kind of desperation that made Ruth's whole body go still. She sat up straight, the album sliding off her lap and onto the floor with a soft thud. Her heart was going quick now, quicker than it had any business going at her age. She listened. The pounding stopped, then started again, weaker this time, like whoever was out there was running out of strength to keep it up. "Lord," she whispered, pushing herself up out of the chair. Her joints ached with the dampness in the air, but she moved anyway, quick as she could manage, down the hall to the hook by her bedroom door where Frank's old flashlight still hung, heavy and metal, the kind they didn't make anymore. She'd kept it charged for 30 years out of habit, never once needing it for more than a power outage. Her hand wrapped around the cool metal now, and it felt heavier than she remembered. She padded down the narrow staircase in her socks, the wood cold and creaking under each step, her heart hammering louder than the rain on the roof. The pounding came again. 3 more thuds, softer, more desperate, and then a sound that stopped her cold on the last step. A groan. A man's voice, low and pained, barely carrying over the storm. Ruth's hand tightened on the flashlight. Every instinct in her body told her to call someone, to wait, to think this through. But there was something in that groan, something raw and hurting, that reminded her too much of nights she'd spent listening for her boys to come home safe, ears straining in the dark for any sign of trouble. She crossed the dark shop floor, weaving between shelves of paint cans and coiled rope, until she reached the back door. Her hand hovered over the deadbolt. "Who's there?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. No answer came, only another weak thud against the door, like someone had run clean out of words. Ruth flipped the flashlight on and threw back the deadbolt. She opened the door. The storm rushed in first, cold and wet and howling, and then she saw them. 3 men, crumpled together in a heap against her doorframe, their wrists and ankles bound in heavy chains that glinted dully under the flashlight's beam. Padlocks hung from the links like ugly ornaments. The men were soaked to the bone, rain running in rivers down faces that were bruised and swollen, blood mixing with rainwater and dripping off their chins onto the wooden steps. The one in front, broad-shouldered even in his ruin, lifted his head slowly. His eyes met hers, dark and guarded even through the pain, like he was bracing himself for the door to slam shut in his face, like he expected it, like he'd learned to expect it from people who saw men like him. Ruth didn't slam the door. She looked at the chains cutting into their wrists, The blood, the exhaustion carved so deep into their faces they looked like men who'd forgotten what rest even felt like. She looked past the leather vests, past the ink on their knuckles, past everything the world might have told her to be afraid of. All she saw were 3 broken men, freezing and bleeding on her doorstep in the middle of a storm. "Don't worry, sons," she said, her voice steady now, steadier than she felt. "I'll help you." And then she turned, flashlight beams swinging wild across the dark shop, and ran for her bolt cutters. The bolt cutters hung on the wall where Frank had always kept them, right between the hand saws and the box of rusted nails nobody ever bought. Ruth grabbed them without thinking, the weight familiar in her hands even after all these years of just dusting them off once a season. She hurried back to the door, and the wind slapped a spray of rain across her face as she knelt down in front of the big one, the one who had looked at her like he already knew what rejection tasted like. "Hold still now," she said. "This might pinch a little." He didn't answer. He just watched her, his jaw tight, like he was waiting for the trick, waiting for the part where this all went wrong. Ruth had seen that look before, a long time ago, on her youngest boy's face when he was 17, and sure the whole world was against him. It was a look that said, "I don't trust you yet, but I want to." She positioned the cutters around the first link and squeezed. Nothing. She squeezed again, harder, throwing her whole body weight into it, teeth gritted. The metal groaned, and then, with a sharp snap that seemed to echo louder than the thunder rolling outside, the chain gave way. "There," she breathed, moving to his ankles next. Thunder cracked directly overhead, close enough to rattle the windows in their frames, and one of the other men flinched hard, chains rattling against the wooden steps. Ruth didn't flinch. She just kept working, link by link, cutting through years of cruelty like it was nothing more than a stubborn padlock on a shed door. "You're gonna be all right," she murmured, mostly to herself, mostly to keep her own hands steady. "Just gotta get you loose, get you inside, get you warm." The second man was younger, barely more than a boy, really, though his face was already hardening into something rougher than his years. He watched her with wide eyes, disbelief written plain across his bruised features, like he couldn't understand why an old woman in her nightgown was kneeling in the rain to save him. "Why?" he finally rasped, voice cracking. "Why are you helping us?" Ruth didn't look up from her work. "Because you're bleeding on my porch, and it's raining, and nobody deserves to be left in chains. That's why." She cut through his wrists next, the chains falling away with a heavy clatter, and he flexed his fingers slowly, wincing at the raw red marks left behind. The third man, the quietest one, said nothing at all. He just watched her hands move, watched the bolt cutters bite through metal like they were nothing, and something in his face softened just slightly, like a wall crumbling one brick at a time. By the time she'd freed all 3 of them, Ruth's arms ached something fierce, and her nightgown was soaked clean through, sticking cold against her skin. But she didn't stop to catch her breath. She couldn't. Not yet. "Up," she said, tucking the bolt cutters under one arm and reaching down to help the big one to his feet. "Up now, all of you. We need to get you inside." They struggled up, leaning on each other, leaning on the doorframe, every movement slow and pained. Ruth got her shoulder under the big one's arm despite his size, despite the way he probably outweighed her by 100 pounds, and half dragged him through the shop. "Cellar doors this way," she said, voice tight with effort. "Quick now." She led them past the shelves of paint and rope, toward the old wooden door set into the back wall, the one that led down into the cellar where Frank used to store his tools, and before that, where her own boys used to hide during games of hide-and-seek. She threw it open and ushered the men down the narrow steps, one by one, her hands steady on their backs. "Down you go. Watch the last step, it's a bit—" That was when she saw it. A pair of headlights sweeping slow and deliberate across the gravel of her front lot, cutting through the rain like searching eyes. "Down!" she hissed, shoving the last man through the door and pulling it shut behind them, plunging them all into darkness. Not a sound. Not one sound. Ruth pressed her back against the cold cellar wall, one hand flat against the rough wood of the door, listening. Above the drum of rain on the roof, she heard the low growl of an engine crawling past the shop. Slow. Too slow. The kind of slow that meant somebody was looking hard for something they hadn't found yet. Nobody in the cellar moved. Nobody breathed too loud. Ruth counted the seconds the way she used to count contractions, back when she was young and scared and waiting for something to be over. 1, 2, 3. The engine noise faded, swallowed by the storm, heading on down the highway toward town. Ruth let her breath out slow. "They're gone," she whispered. "For now." She felt around on the shelf beside her until her fingers found the old brass lantern Frank used to keep down here for when the power went out. She struck a match, and the little flame caught, throwing soft yellow light across the cellar walls. That was when she got her first real look at the 3 men she'd just cut loose. The big one, the one who'd locked eyes with her on the porch, sat propped against a stack of old paint cans, his knees pulled up, one arm wrapped tight around his ribs like he was holding himself together. His leather vest was torn and soaked through, but she could still make out the patches sewn across it. A winged skull. Letters she didn't fully understand, but recognized enough to know what they meant. Hell's Angels. He looked to be around Ruth's own son's age, maybe a little older, with a hard, weathered face and eyes that didn't miss a thing. The younger one, the one who'd asked her why, sat near the stairs, rubbing his raw wrists. His hair was matted with blood on one side, a gash above his ear that needed stitches or at least a good, clean bandage. He couldn't have been much past 25. The quiet one, the third, had his back against the far wall, arms wrapped around his knees, saying nothing, just watching her with the kind of caution she'd seen once in a stray dog that had been kicked one too many times. "Well," Ruth said, setting the lantern down on an overturned crate. "Let's have a look at you boys." The big one's jaw tightened. "We don't need charity, lady." "Didn't say it was charity," Ruth said, already moving toward the shelf where she kept the first aid kit, the same metal box she'd used 40 years ago on skinned knees and busted lips, back when her own sons were small enough to come running to her crying. "Called it common decency. Now hold still." She knelt in front of him first, popping open the kit. Gauze, antiseptic, a roll of medical tape gone slightly yellow with age but still good. She reached for his ribs, and he grabbed her wrist, not hard, just firm. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, echoing the younger man's question from the porch, his voice low and rough. Ruth looked him square in the eye. "Ask me again in the morning." He held her gaze a long moment, searching for the trick, the catch, the thing that would make this all make sense the way the rest of his life had taught him things were supposed to make sense. He didn't find it. Slowly he let go of her wrist. She worked quiet and steady, cleaning the cut along his ribs, taping gauze over the worst of it. Then she moved to the younger one, tilting his head gently to get at the gash above his ear, tutting softly at the mess of it. "You're gonna have a heck of a headache come morning," she murmured. He winced, but didn't pull away. Last was the quiet one. He flinched when she first reached for him, and she paused, waited, let him see her hands before she touched him again. Slowly, he allowed it. She cleaned a split knuckle, wrapped a sprained wrist, working in silence. When she finished, she gathered up the leftover gauze and tape, tucking the kit closed. From an old trunk in the corner, she pulled 3 thin quilts, worn soft with age, and handed one to each of them. "Rest now," she said, straightening up with a small groan, her knees complaining after all these years. "We'll talk in the morning." She climbed the cellar stairs, and at the top, she pulled the door shut behind her, easing the lock into place, gentle, so as not to make them feel like prisoners all over again. Morning came gray and soft, the storm worn out from its long night of shouting. Ruth woke before her alarm, same as always, her body still running on the clock it had kept for 40 years of making Frank's breakfast before he opened the shop. Old habits didn't care that everything else had changed. She stood in her kitchen frying eggs, 6 of them, plus a whole package of bacon she'd been saving for Sunday. The smell filled the house, warm and familiar, and for a moment she let herself forget what was waiting down in that cellar. Just a woman making breakfast. Just an ordinary day. Then she loaded it all onto a tray, added a pot of coffee and 4 mismatched mugs, and carried it down the creaking stairs. The 3 men looked rougher in daylight, even the dim gray light that came through the little cellar window. Bruises had bloomed dark purple and yellow across the big one's face. The younger one's bandage had a spot of blood soaked through. But they were sitting up, awake, watching her come down the steps with the kind of wary stillness she imagined they'd learned a long time ago, in a life that hadn't been kind to them. "Eat," Ruth said simply, setting the tray on the crate. "Can't think straight on an empty stomach. Never could." For a moment, nobody moved. Then the younger one, the one with the gash over his ear, reached for a plate like he couldn't help himself. The big one watched him a second longer before he did the same. They ate in silence at first, Ruth pouring coffee, settling herself down on an overturned bucket like she had all the time in the world, which, she supposed, she did. It was the big one who finally spoke, once his plate was clean and his coffee half gone. "Name's Jax," he said. "That's Milo." He nodded toward the younger one. "And Deacon." The quiet one lifted his eyes just enough to acknowledge his name, then looked back down at his plate. "Ruth," she said. "Ruth Callahan." Jax turned his mug slow in his hands, staring at it like it might have answers written on the bottom. "You want to know why we were chained up like dogs behind your store?" It wasn't a question, so Ruth didn't answer it like one. She just waited, the way she used to wait for her boys to work up the courage to tell her what really happened at school. "There's a club running through this county," Jax said. "Calls themselves the Vipers. They wanted us moving product for them. Drugs, through Miller's Creek, up the highway corridor. Good money in it, they said." His jaw worked, like the words tasted bad going down. "We told them no. Our club don't run that. Never has." "So they did this," Ruth said quietly, gesturing at the bruises, the cuts, the memory of 3 men chained together in her reign. "Message to anybody else thinking about saying no," Milo said, voice still rough from the pain in his skull. "Chain us up behind some backwoods store. Let the storm do the rest. Figured nobody'd find us till it was too late to matter." Deacon said nothing, just stared at the wall, his hands wrapped tight around his mug like it was the only warm thing left in the world. Ruth was quiet a long moment. She thought about her own boys, grown now and mostly gone, and how she used to tell them that doing right didn't always feel like winning. Sometimes it felt exactly like this. Beaten, chained, alone in the rain with nobody looking. "Well," she said finally, standing up, brushing the crumbs from her apron. "You did right by saying no. That's not nothing, even if it feels like it right now." Jax looked up at her, something unreadable moving behind his hard eyes. "You'll stay here," Ruth said, and there was no room for argument in her voice. Same tone she used to use when the boys said they weren't hungry, and she knew better. "Down here, hidden, till you're healed proper. Can't have you stumbling around half-mended and getting caught again." "Ma'am, we can't ask you to—" "Didn't ask you to ask," Ruth cut in. "You'll stay as long as you need, and you'll come up for supper every night. I don't care how banged up you are. I'm not eating alone in that big house one more night than I have to." She gathered the empty plates onto the tray, leaving the coffee pot behind, and climbed the stairs without waiting for an answer. The days took on a rhythm, one Ruth hadn't felt in her house since Frank passed. Mornings meant eggs and bandages. Afternoons meant the quiet clink of her puttering around the shop upstairs, selling nails and paint to the handful of regulars who still came through. Evenings meant supper. The same time every night, the four of them gathered around her kitchen table like it was the most natural thing in the world. She started cooking more. Pot roast on Tuesdays, chicken and dumplings on Thursdays. She hadn't cooked for a full table in years, and something in her chest loosened every time she watched Milo take a second helping without asking, like he still couldn't believe nobody was going to stop him. The bruises faded first. Milo's gash healed clean, leaving a thin white scar above his ear that he touched sometimes without noticing. Deacon's ribs stopped catching every time he breathed too deep. Jax's face lost its swelling, and underneath it, Ruth saw a man maybe 10 years older than she'd first guessed, worn down by something more than the beating he'd taken. It was on the 9th night, over bowls of beef stew, that Jax finally talked about himself, without her having to ask. "Had a mother once," he said, staring into his bowl like the words were easier to say to the stew than to Ruth. "She passed when I was 19. Dad was already gone by then, took off when I was a kid. No brothers, no sisters. Just me." He shrugged, like it didn't matter, though the stiffness in his shoulders said otherwise. "Club's the only family I've had since. 20-some years now." Ruth didn't say anything soft or pitying. She just nodded, the way she would have for one of her own boys, and passed him the bread. Deacon opened up 2 nights later, quieter about it, the way he seemed to do everything. "Got a daughter," he said, turning his coffee mug in slow circles. "Sarah. She's 12 now. Her mother and I didn't work out, and I don't blame her for keeping distance. Man like me, the life I live, it's not something you want your kid seeing up close." He paused. "I send money, birthday cards. Don't know if she even opens them anymore." "You ever think about asking her?" Ruth said gently. Deacon's jaw tightened. "Some doors you're scared to knock on, case nobody answers." Ruth didn't push. She just refilled his coffee and let the silence do the comforting instead. Milo's turn came near the end of the 2nd week, the night before they were set to finally sleep somewhere other than her cellar floor. He was the youngest, and it showed in the way he talked, quick and eager, like he'd been waiting his whole life for someone to actually listen. "Grew up in foster care," he said. "Bounced around 7-8 houses before I turned 16. Never had nobody who stuck around. Then I found the club, and it was like, I don't know. First time in my life somebody had my back just because I was theirs. Brotherhood." He smiled, a little embarrassed. "Sounds stupid, probably." "Doesn't sound stupid at all," Ruth said. "Sounds like exactly what everybody's looking for, whether they know it or not." By the end of the 2nd week, the men were strong enough to move without wincing, strong enough to think about leaving, about getting back to whatever life waited for them beyond Miller's Creek. They talked about it quietly among themselves in the evenings, planning routes, talking about which chapter might take them in while things cooled down with the Vipers. Ruth didn't push them to stay, and she didn't push them to go. She just kept setting 4 places at her table every night, like the answer hadn't been decided yet. It was a Wednesday morning when the delivery truck came, same as it did every week, dropping off boxes of nails and hinges at the back of the shop. Ruth was up front ringing up a customer when she heard the truck door slam. Then an engine roar to life a little too fast, tires spitting gravel as it pulled away. She didn't think much of it until that afternoon, when Mrs. Pruitt from the diner came in for a can of paint and leaned close over the counter. Voice dropped low and thrilled with the kind of gossip that spreads through a small town like fire through dry grass. "Ruth, honey," she said, "is it true you've got bikers hiding in your cellar?" Ruth didn't answer Mrs. Pruitt right away. She just smiled and rang up the paint, slow and steady, the way she did everything. "Now where would you hear a thing like that?" she asked, not confirming, not denying. Mrs. Pruitt huffed like she'd expected more of a show, took her paint, and left with the bell jangling behind her. By Friday, the whispers had legs. Ruth could feel it in the way folks looked at her a little longer than usual at the post office, the way conversations dipped low when she walked into the diner for her Sunday coffee. Small towns didn't need proof. They just needed a rumor, and enough time to let it grow teeth. The Vipers came on a gray afternoon, right as Ruth was locking up the register drawer. 2 men walked through her front door like they owned the place, boots heavy on the wood floor, leather vests marked with a coiled green snake stitched over the heart. One was tall and thin as a fence post, the other built like a refrigerator, arms crossed over a chest wide enough to block the doorway. "Heard you've been keeping some strays," the thin one said. His voice was soft, almost polite, which somehow made it worse. Ruth kept her hands flat on the counter. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb, old woman." The big one stepped closer, boots thudding. 3 of our problems went missing 2 weeks back. Word is you patched them up real nice. Fed them at your table like they were your own boys." "Whoever told you that," Ruth said, voice even as still water, "was telling stories." The thin one leaned over the counter, close enough that Ruth could smell cigarette smoke on his jacket. "We're not here to argue, ma'am. We're here to give you a choice. You hand over whatever's left of Coleman's crew, or this place goes up in flames tonight. Simple as that." Ruth didn't flinch. She reached under the counter, slow and deliberate, and the big one tensed like he expected a shotgun. Instead, she pulled out an old camcorder, boxy and scratched, the kind nobody made anymore. Frank's camcorder. She'd used it to film Christmas mornings once, birthday parties, the boys blowing out candles. "This has been running since you 2 walked through that door," she said, setting it on the counter, the little red light blinking steady. "Every word. Your faces, too." The thin one's jaw tightened. "You think that scares us? You think we're worried about cops?" "I don't much care what the police do with it," Ruth said. "This isn't for them. This is for my scrapbook. Proof that good men still exist, even when they wear the wrong jacket. Proof that some men choose to be monsters when they didn't have to." She looked the big one dead in the eye, unblinking. "You want to burn my store down? You go right ahead. But you'll do it with your faces already recorded, and half this county will know exactly who to blame." The silence stretched long and tight. The big one looked at the thin one, some unspoken question passing between them. Ruth had seen that look before, in men twice her size buying nails from her husband 30 years back. It was the look of men used to being feared, suddenly unsure of what to do with someone who wasn't afraid of them at all. They left without another word, the bell over the door ringing behind them like nothing had happened. News of it moved fast, faster than Ruth could have imagined. Somebody talked, maybe the delivery driver, maybe Mrs. Pruitt, maybe the whole town at once. Within days, word had crawled its way out of Miller's Creek and into biker circles 3 states over, the story growing bigger with every retelling. An old woman, bolt cutters, 3 chained angels freed in her cellar. A camcorder pointed at the vipers like a loaded gun. On a Saturday morning, Ruth stepped out onto her porch with a cup of coffee and stopped cold. The road in front of her shop was filled, bumper to bumper, chrome catching the morning sun. Nearly 200 motorcycles idled in silence, engines rumbling low like distant thunder, riders standing beside their bikes with helmets tucked under their arms, heads bowed toward her like she was something holy. Ruth's coffee mug trembled in her hand. She didn't know what to do with a sight like that, didn't know where to put the swell rising in her chest. That was when David's car came screeching around the corner, tires shrieking against asphalt, horn blaring as he shoved his way through the crowd of bikes toward the porch, face red with a fury Ruth hadn't seen since his father's funeral. "Mom," he shouted, slamming his car door, "have you completely lost your mind?" The morning light came in soft through the kitchen window, but there was nothing soft about David's face when Ruth found him standing at her table, arms crossed, coffee untouched in front of him. "Sit down, Mom," he said. "We need to talk." "I'll stand, thank you," Ruth said, tying her apron behind her back like it was any other Sunday. "I've got biscuits to get in the oven." "The biscuits can wait." David's voice was flat, controlled, the way it got when he was trying hardest not to yell. "This can't." Ruth set down her mixing bowl and looked at her son. Really looked at him. He had his father's jaw, set hard like stone when he was upset, but his eyes were all Ruth's side of the family, and right now they were full of something that looked like fear wearing anger's clothes. "You want to talk," she said. "So talk." "You're 68 years old," David started, ticking it off like the first line on a list he'd been rehearsing in his car the whole drive over. "You're living alone. You're running a hardware store by yourself in a town that's half boarded up already. And now," his voice rose, cracking at the edges, "now you've got the Hells Angels using your kitchen table like it's their clubhouse." "They needed help," Ruth said simply. "They're criminals, Mom." "They were chained up and bleeding in my yard," Ruth said, and her voice didn't rise to meet his. It never did. "That's not a criminal. That's somebody's son." Outside the kitchen window, Ruth caught sight of Jax standing near the porch steps, arms crossed, not coming closer. Deacon leaned against the fence post a little ways off, and Milo sat on the tailgate of his truck, picking at a thread on his jeans, none of them looking at each other, none of them looking at the house either. They'd heard David's car pull up. They knew enough to stay outside. "Do you have any idea what this looks like?" David pressed on. "The Callahan name, tied to a motorcycle gang? People already think you've lost it. I got calls, Mom, from people in town, from my own co-workers who saw it on some biker forum online. 200 motorcycles outside your store. It's not safe. It's not sane." "I'm perfectly sane," Ruth said, and this time there was steel under the words. "I have been making decisions in this house since before you could walk, David Callahan, and I'll keep making them till the good Lord decides otherwise." "This isn't about you being capable," David snapped. "This is about you being reckless. You could have been killed. That store could burn down with you in it. And you're sitting here defending men with skull patches like they're choir boys." Ruth wiped her hands on her apron, slow, giving herself a moment before she spoke again. "You know what I asked those men for, when I found them near dead in my yard? Nothing. Not money. Not thanks. I asked them to stop by for supper sometimes. That's all. And you know what they did? They came. Every single time." She looked at him steady. When was the last time you came for supper, David? That landed somewhere it wasn't supposed to. David's jaw tightened, and for a second something flickered behind his eyes, something that looked almost like hurt trying to disguise itself as anger. This isn't about supper, he said, quieter now, but no less hard. Isn't it? Ruth stepped closer. Because this feels like something bigger than worry, son. It feels like you're angry I found people to take care of, when you stopped needing me to take care of you a long time ago. David's mouth opened, then closed. His hands balled into fists at his sides, then loosened again, like he didn't know what to do with them. I'm not doing this, he muttered, shaking his head. I'm not doing this right now. He turned and walked out, the screen door banging shut behind him hard enough to rattle the window glass. Ruth heard his car door slam a second later, tires spitting gravel as he pulled away too fast down the drive. She stood alone in her kitchen, hands trembling slightly against the counter, staring at the space where her son had just been. Outside, Jax watched David's car disappear down the road before turning to Deacon and Milo. We give her room, he said quietly. Let the old woman fix her own house. The next morning, Ruth woke to the sound of hammering. She lay still for a moment, blinking at the ceiling, trying to place the noise. Then she remembered the storm from 2 weeks back, the one that had torn a strip of shingles clean off the back corner of the shop roof. She'd been meaning to call someone. She'd been meaning to do a lot of things since Frank died, and most of them stayed on the meaning to list a lot longer than they should have. She pulled on her robe and went out the back door, and there was Deacon, up on a ladder, a mouthful of nails and a hammer in his hand, working the new shingles into place like he'd done it 100 times before. Milo was below him, sorting through a stack of lumber, sleeves rolled up, whistling something under his breath that didn't have a tune Ruth recognized. What in the world? Ruth said, standing in the yard with her arms crossed. Deacon took the nails out of his mouth. Morning, ma'am. Roof had a bad patch. Figured we'd fix it before the next rain got in and ruined your stock. I didn't ask you to do that. No, ma'am, Milo said, grinning up at her. You didn't. Ruth opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. There wasn't much to argue with. The roof did need fixing, and nobody was asking her for a dime. Inside the shop, things were just as strange. She found the shelves that had gone half empty since her last order restocked, boxes of nails and hinges and paint cans lined up neat as soldiers. The dusty back corner where Frank used to keep the seasonal stuff had been swept and organized, old inventory sorted from new. Someone had even fixed the bell over the front door that had been sticking for a year. And then there was Jax. She found him at her kitchen table one afternoon, a stack of papers spread out in front of him, her late husband's old ledger book open beside a calculator. He looked up when she came in. Not sheepish exactly, but careful, like a man who knew he might be overstepping and had decided to do it anyway. Your accounts were a mess, Ms. Ruth, he said. Bills stacking up. Some of these you're paying interest on you don't need to be paying. I used to do books for a garage before all this. He gestured vaguely at himself, at the leather vest hanging off the back of the chair. I can get this straightened out for you, if you'll let me. Ruth stood in the doorway, looking at the man who used to scare half the county, hunched over her late husband's ledger with a pencil behind his ear. Why are you all doing this? She asked, and her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. Jack set the pencil down. You cut our chains, ma'am. Nobody ever did something like that for us and asked for nothing back. Fixing a roof and some numbers, that's not even close to even. She didn't have an answer for that. She just nodded and went back outside, because if she stayed in that kitchen one more second, she was going to cry, and she wasn't ready to do that in front of him yet. The days went like that. Deacon on the roof, then inside fixing the creaky step by the storeroom. Milo unloading a delivery truck, stacking bags of concrete mix like they weighed nothing. Jax with his papers and his pencil, working through Frank's tangled old system a little more each evening. It was a Thursday when Ruth found them still at it long after the sun went down. She'd gone to bed early, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age, and when she got up for a glass of water, she saw the lights still on in the shop out back. She pulled her robe tight and walked out across the yard, and there they were, all three of them, sweat-soaked and dusty, Deacon still up on the ladder in the porch light, Milo sweeping sawdust into a pile, Jax squinting at columns of numbers by lamplight. Ruth stood in the doorway and felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been sealed shut a long time. "That's it," she said, and her voice wobbled. "Put those tools down, all of you." Jax looked up, alarmed. "Ma'am, if we did something wrong, you didn't do anything wrong." Ruth wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, not caring that they saw. "I'm cooking Sunday dinner, a real one, pot roast, biscuits, the works, and you are all going to sit at my table and eat like decent people, and that is not a request." Milo grinned, wide and boyish. "Yes, ma'am." "Every Sunday," Ruth said, looking at each of them in turn. "From now on, you hear me?" Deacon climbed down from the ladder, wiping his hands on his jeans. "We hear you, Ms. Ruth." And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Ruth Callahan walked back into her house, feeling like it was full again. The next Sunday came, and Ruth was in her kitchen before the sun even climbed all the way over the tree line. She had her apron on, the one with the faded sunflowers that Frank had given her 20 years back, and she moved around the kitchen the way she always did, quick and sure despite her years, like her hands still remembered every step even when her mind wandered off. The pot roast was already in the oven, filling the house with the smell of onions and garlic and thyme. She had a pot of green beans going on the stove, and she was working on the biscuit dough, flour dusted up to her elbows, when she heard the boys pull into the driveway. Their bikes rumbled low, then cut off one after another, and she smiled without looking up from the counter. "In here," she called out. "Don't track mud on my floor." Milo came in first, laughing about something Deacon had said on the ride over, and Deacon followed close behind, ducking his head under the doorframe out of habit even though he didn't need to. Jax came last, quiet as always, but there was something easier in the way he carried himself now. Weeks of Sunday dinners had softened something in him that Ruth suspected had been hard for a long, long time. "Smells like heaven in here, Ms. Ruth," Milo said, dropping into a chair at the table. "Wash your hands first," Ruth said without turning around. "All of you." They did, laughing, bumping shoulders at the sink like brothers. Ruth turned back to her biscuits, rolling the dough out on the floured board, humming some old tune under her breath. She reached for the rolling pin, and that was when it happened. A tightness gripped her chest, sudden and hard, like a fist closing around her heart. The rolling pin slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the counter. She gasped, one hand flying to her chest, the other reaching for something to hold on to. But there was nothing there. Her knees buckled. "Ms. Ruth!" Jax was already moving before she even started to fall, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. He caught her just as her legs gave out completely, one arm hooking under her shoulders, the other bracing her back, lowering her gently to the kitchen floor instead of letting her crumple. "Ruth!" Deacon was there too now, kneeling on her other side, his face gone pale under his beard. "Ruth, can you hear me?" Her eyes were open but glassy, unfocused, her breath coming in short, shallow pulls. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. "Milo!" Jax's voice cracked like a whip, all the calm gone out of it. "Get the neighbors now! Somebody call an ambulance!" Milo was already running, out the back door and across the yard toward the Hendersons' place, hollering their name before he even reached the porch. Behind him, the screen door slammed against the frame. Jax pulled his phone from his pocket, one hand still cradling Ruth's head off the hard floor, and dialed with fingers that were shaking despite years of steadiness under pressure. "I need an ambulance," he said, his voice tight and controlled even though his heart was hammering. "Callahan's Hardware on Route 9. Woman, 68 years old, chest pain. She just collapsed." He rattled off the address again when the dispatcher asked, never taking his eyes off Ruth's face. "Stay with me," he murmured to her, low and steady, the way he might talk down a spooked animal. "You stay with me now, you hear? Don't you go anywhere." Ruth's eyes fluttered, found his face, and something in them tried to focus. Her hand found his sleeve and gripped weakly. "Deacon, get a pillow. Something soft," Jax said. Deacon was up and moving before the sentence finished, yanking a cushion off the nearest chair and sliding it under Ruth's head. The sound of sirens rose faint in the distance, growing louder by the second. Milo came pounding back through the yard with Mr. Henderson right behind him, both of them out of breath. "They're coming," Milo said, dropping to his knees beside Ruth. "Ambulance is coming, Ms. Ruth. Just hold on." Ruth's lips moved again. Barely a whisper. "The biscuits," she breathed. "Don't let them burn." Despite everything, Jax felt something crack in his chest at that. This woman lying on her own kitchen floor worrying about biscuits. "I've got it," he said, voice thick. "I've got everything. You just hold on." The ambulance pulled into the driveway moments later, red lights washing across the kitchen windows, and the paramedics came through the door fast, kits in hand, taking over with practiced hands while Jax finally stepped back, his shirt sleeve still damp where Ruth's fingers had gripped it. David's shoes squeaked against the hospital floor as he came around the corner to the ICU waiting area, still wearing his work clothes because he'd driven straight from the office the second his phone rang. His tie was loose around his neck, his jacket rumpled from the drive, and his eyes had that hollow, unfocused look of a man who hadn't slept and didn't plan to until he knew something. He'd expected an empty hallway, maybe a nurse or two. What he did not expect was to find 3 grown men in leather vests sprawled across the plastic chairs, like they'd been carved into them, looking like they hadn't moved in hours. Milo was asleep sitting up, his head tipped back against the wall, mouth open. Deacon sat with his elbows on his knees, staring at nothing, a paper cup of coffee gone cold in his hands. And through the little window into Ruth's room, David could see Jax, sitting in the chair beside the bed, holding his mother's hand like it was made of glass. David stopped in the doorway, his jaw tightening on instinct, the old anger flaring up automatic as breathing. These men, these outlaws. Here, in this sterile hallway, at his mother's bedside, like they had any right. But then he heard Jax's voice, low and rough, coming through the cracked door. "You gotta wake up now, Ms. Ruth," Jax was saying, his big hand wrapped gentle around her small one, thumb moving slow across her knuckles. "Who's gonna yell at me about tracking mud on the floor if you don't wake up? Huh? Who's gonna make me eat my vegetables?" Ruth didn't stir. The machines beeped their steady rhythm beside her, the only reply. "Come on now," Jax said quieter. "You didn't drag me out of them chains just to leave me here alone. That ain't fair. You know that ain't fair." David felt something shift in his chest, something he didn't have a name for yet. He stood frozen in the doorway a moment longer, watching this man, this stranger who wore a patch on his back like armor, speak to his mother with more tenderness than David had managed in years. Deacon noticed him first. "David," he said, voice rough with exhaustion, sitting up straighter. Milo's eyes blinked open, and he scrambled to his feet fast, like he'd been caught at something. Jax looked up. For a second, something passed over his face. Guilt, maybe, or wariness, like he expected David to order him out. But he didn't let go of Ruth's hand. He just nodded once. "David." "How is she?" David said, his voice tighter than he meant it. "Stable," Jax said. "Doctor said the next day or two is what matters. She's strong, though. Fought us on everything since the day we met her. Don't figure she'll go easy now, either." David nodded, not trusting his voice yet. He looked past Jax to his mother's face, pale against the white pillow, her hair thin and gray, spread out around her like she was already somewhere far away. It scared him more than he wanted to admit. "You three been here all night?" he asked. "Wasn't gonna leave her alone," Jax said simply, like it wasn't even a question worth asking. David swallowed hard. He looked at Jax's hand, still wrapped around his mother's, at the tenderness in it, and something in him that had been clenched tight for years loosened just a fraction of an inch. "Thank you," David said finally, the words coming out stiff and awkward like they didn't fit right in his mouth, "for staying with her." Jax studied him for a moment, then gently set Ruth's hand down on the blanket and stood, joints popping from sitting too long in one position. He nodded toward the hallway. "Walk with me a minute." David hesitated, then followed him out, leaving Deacon and Milo behind in the waiting room. They stood a few feet apart in the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway, neither one quite looking at the other. "She talk about me?" David asked finally, the question surprising even himself. "All the time," Jax said. "Showed us pictures, told us about your ball games when you were a kid, told us you were smart, stubborn, said you got that from her." David's throat tightened. "She's all I got left," he said quietly. "Since Dad. I know I haven't acted like it, but she's all I got." Jax nodded slow. "She's all we got, too," he said. "Different kind of family. But she gave it to us anyway. Didn't ask for nothing back." The two men stood there in the quiet hallway, the weight of Ruth between them, something unspoken beginning to shift. Ruth's front porch had always creaked in the same 3 spots, and she knew them by heart. Left foot on the second board, right foot skip the 5th, settle into the old rocking chair her husband built 40 years back. She hadn't sat in it since the stroke. The doctor said she needed rest, said her body had been through something most people her age didn't walk away from. But sitting inside those 4 walls felt like waiting to die, and Ruth Callahan had never been much good at waiting. So on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after she came home, with a walker she mostly ignored, and a home health aide who came twice a week to check on her, Ruth made her way out to the porch and lowered herself into that chair. The wood still remembered her shape. She heard the truck before she saw it. David's truck, the tires crunching up the gravel drive, and her heart did something complicated in her chest, something that wasn't the bad kind of flutter the doctors worried about. This was different. This was hope. The doors opened, and out spilled her grandchildren Emma and Tyler, 7 and 9 years old, faces bright with the kind of excitement only a weekend away from school could bring. They hadn't visited much these last years. David had kept them close, kept them careful, like Ruth's world was something that might rub off on them wrong. But here they were now, backpacks bouncing, already running towards the porch before David had even cut the engine. "Grandma!" Emma called out, and the sound of it near broke Ruth's heart open with joy. David climbed out slower, watching his children climb the porch steps to hug their grandmother, careful not to squeeze too hard, mindful of the things the doctor had said about her heart. He stood at the bottom of the steps a moment, hands in his pockets, something unreadable on his face. "Just the weekend," he said. "I have to be back Monday for work." "That's all I need," Ruth said, and she meant it. It was Milo who came around the side of the house, pushing 2 small dirt bikes, their engines silent for now, paint bright red and blue. Deacon had found them at an estate sale for next to nothing, and Milo had spent 2 evenings in the driveway getting them running right, tuning the engines down so they wouldn't go faster than a slow jog. "Who wants to learn how to ride?" Milo called out, grinning wide, and Tyler was down the steps before David could even open his mouth to ask. Ruth watched David's face carefully, watched the flicker of worry cross it, the old instinct to say no, to keep his children close and safe and away from anything with an engine or leather vest attached to it. But he didn't say no. He just stood there, arms crossed, watching as Milo knelt down to Tyler's height and showed him where the brake was, how to balance his feet, how to go slow. "Safety first," Milo said, buckling a helmet under Tyler's chin, adjusting the strap twice to make sure it was snug. "Your grandma will have my head if you skin a knee." Emma wanted to turn too, and Milo was patient with her, walking alongside the little bike with his hand hovering near the seat, ready to catch her if she wobbled. The engine puttered along at barely more than a walking pace, and still the kids squealed like they were flying. David stood by the porch steps, and slowly, without seeming to notice he was doing it, he moved closer to the yard. Ruth watched him from her chair, rocking gentle, her hands folded in her lap. Tyler wobbled hard on a turn, and nearly tipped, catching himself with 1 foot down, laughing at his own near disaster. Emma copied her brother, exaggerating a wobble on purpose just to hear everyone laugh again. And then it happened. David laughed. Not a polite chuckle, not the careful, controlled sound Ruth had grown used to over the years. A real laugh, loose and surprised out of him, both hands coming up to cover his mouth, like he couldn't quite believe it either. Ruth's eyes filled up watching it, watching her son unguarded for the first time in longer than she could remember, watching her grandchildren ride in tight, wobbly circles under Milo's careful eye. The afternoon sun warm on all of them. The call came on a Tuesday, while Ruth was sitting at the kitchen table sorting through mail with Deacon's help. Her hands still shook some, and reading the small print gave her trouble, so Deacon had taken to reading the bills out loud while she nodded along. The phone rang. Deacon answered it because Ruth's hands were full of envelopes, and he handed it over a second later with a raised eyebrow. "Town council," he said. "For you." Ruth pressed the phone to her ear. On the other end was Sandra Willoughby, who ran the council meetings and had known Ruth for 30 years, ever since Sandra's own husband bought his first box of nails at Callahan's Hardware. "Ruth, honey, we've been talking," Sandra said. "The whole council. About what happened to your shop, and about everything since. We want to do something. A festival, maybe. Raise some money to help fix what the storm tore up, and also just celebrate. You, what you did, what you've built." Ruth sat quiet a moment, the phone warm against her ear, and Deacon watched her face carefully, trying to read what was happening. "You want to throw a party for an old woman and 3 bikers," Ruth said, and there was a smile buried in her voice. "We want to throw a party for family," Sandra said. "However that family looks. Miller's Creek could use something good to celebrate, Ruth. Lord knows we've had enough hard years." Ruth felt something warm bloom in her chest, something that had nothing to do with her heart trouble and everything to do with the kind of joy she hadn't let herself feel in a long while. Yes, she said, before she'd even fully thought it through. Yes, let's do it. When she hung up the phone, Deacon was still watching her, his arms crossed over his broad chest, a small grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. Festival, Ruth said, answering the question in his eyes. For the shop. For all of us. Word spread through the house fast. Milo whooped loud enough that Emma and Tyler came running in from the yard to see what the excitement was about, and even Jax, who wasn't a man given to big reactions, allowed himself a slow, satisfied nod when Ruth told him the news that evening over supper. Town wants to celebrate you, Jax said, passing the mashed potatoes down the table. Town wants to celebrate all of us, Ruth corrected gently. That's the whole point. The weeks that followed turned into a blur of work. Jax took charge of setting up the sound system and stage, borrowing equipment from a Chapter 2 towns over. Deacon spent his evenings building tables and benches out of scrap lumber, his careful hands measuring twice and cutting once, same as always. Milo threw himself into decorations with more enthusiasm than skill, stringing lights along the fence posts and arguing cheerfully with the church ladies about where the food tables should go. The whole town seemed to catch the fever. The diner offered to cater, the school band volunteered to play, and even old Mr. Pruitt, who'd grumbled about that motorcycle business for months, showed up one afternoon with a truck full of folding chairs he said the Rotary Club wasn't using anymore. Ruth called David on a Thursday evening, her voice careful, hopeful in a way she tried not to let show too much. There's a festival, she said. For the shop. For everybody. I'd love for you and the kids to come. There was a pause on the line, long enough that Ruth wondered if she'd lost the connection. Then David sighed, and she could picture him rubbing at his eyes the way he always did when he was working through something. I don't know, Mom, he said. It's a lot, all of it. The bikers, the town, everybody watching. Nobody's watching anything but a party, Ruth said gently. Just good food and good music and folks glad to be together. Another pause. Ruth waited, holding her breath a little, not wanting to push too hard and lose the ground she'd only just started to gain back. For you, David finally said. We'll come for you, Mom. Not for the bikers, not for the town. For you. That's all I'm asking, Ruth said, and meant every word of it. When she hung up the phone, she sat for a long moment in the quiet kitchen, feeling something settle inside her chest. Something that felt a whole lot like hope, finally taking root. The Saturday of the festival dawned clear and bright, the kind of blue sky morning that felt like a gift after all the storms Miller's Creek had weathered. By noon, the field behind Callahan's hardware had transformed into something out of a dream. String lights crisscrossed between wooden poles, waiting for dusk to show off their glow. Food stalls lined one side of the lot, filling the air with the smell of barbecue and funnel cakes, and Mrs. Petrovsky's famous pierogies. Someone had set up a lemonade stand with a hand-painted sign that read, "Cold drinks for warm hearts." By 2 o'clock, the first rumble of motorcycles echoed down the highway. Ruth stood on her porch, hand shading her eyes, and watched as bike after bike rolled into town. Chapters from 3 states away, just like Jax had promised months ago. The riders parked in neat rows, chrome catching the sun, and climbed off their bikes looking almost shy as the townsfolk stared. But the staring didn't last long. Mr. Pruitt, of all people, was the first to walk up to a leather-clad rider and shake his hand. Heard you boys fixed up half this town without asking for a dime, he said. Figured I owed you a burger at least. After that, the walls came down fast. Kids who'd once hidden behind their mothers' skirts now ran between the bikes, wide-eyed and grinning, while their mothers chatted with riders about the weather and the fair, and whose potato salad recipe was better. Emma and Tyler stuck close to Milo, who let them sit on his bike's seat and pretend to rev the engine, making motorcycle noises with their mouths that made the real bikers laugh. Ruth moved through the crowd, slow, her cane tapping against the packed dirt, stopping every few feet to hug a neighbor or shake a stranger's hand. Everywhere she looked, she saw her two worlds blending together like they'd never been separate at all. The diner ladies were laughing with Deacon over a table he'd built. The school band was setting up right next to Jax's borrowed sound system, working out how to share the stage. When David's car pulled up around 4, Ruth felt her heart squeeze tight with hope and worry both. He climbed out slow, Emma and Tyler already darting past him toward Milo, and for a moment David just stood there, taking it all in. The bikes, the lights, the town he'd grown up in, wide open and unafraid. "Mom," he said, walking up to her, "this is a lot." "It's good, though," Ruth said. "Isn't it?" David looked around one more time, at his kids laughing with Milo, at Deacon waving him over to try a slice of pie, and something in his shoulders loosened. "Yeah," he admitted. "It's good." As the sun dipped low and the string lights flickered on, the school band struck up something slow and sweet, an old song Ruth remembered dancing to with her husband decades ago. Jax appeared at her side first, holding out his hand with a small, careful smile. "May I, ma'am?" Ruth laughed, delighted, and let him lead her out into the open grass where other couples had already started swaying. Jax danced stiff but earnest, careful of her steps, and the whole crowd seemed to hold its breath and smile all at once. When the song shifted, Deacon cut in, spinning her gentle and slow, humming along under his breath. Then came Milo, all energy and joy, twirling her carefully, until she was laughing so hard she had to catch her breath. And then, as the music softened into something quieter, David stepped forward. He held out his hand. Ruth looked at it a long moment, at her son's face, older now, softer than it had been in years, and she placed her hand in his. They danced slow under the string's lights, mother and son, the whole town watching in a hush that felt like reverence. David's eyes were wet, and Ruth reached up to brush his cheek the way she had when he was small. "I've got you, David," she whispered. "I've always got you." The song ended, and the crowd clapped soft and warm, the way people clap when they don't want to break a spell. Ruth patted David's arm and told him she needed to sit a spell, her hip aching from the dancing, and slipped away behind the food tables toward the old folding chairs set up near the back porch steps. The noise of the festival faded there, muffled by the side of the building, just the hum of the band and the far-off laughter of children. She sank into a chair with a tired sigh, rubbing her knee when she heard footsteps behind her. David stood there, hands shoved in his pockets, looking younger somehow in the dim light. Not the stiff, angry man who'd stormed into town weeks ago. Just her boy. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. "Since when do you ask?" Ruth said, patting the chair beside her. He sat, quiet for a long moment, staring out at the string lights swaying gently in the breeze. Ruth waited. She'd learned a long time ago that some things couldn't be rushed out of a person. They had to come on their own time, like rain building in a cloud. "Mom," David finally said, voice rough, "I need to say something, and I need you to just let me get through it." Ruth nodded, folding her hands in her lap. "I've been so angry," he said. "At you, at everything. And I told myself it was because of the bikers, because I was scared for you, because it looked crazy from the outside. But that's not really it." He rubbed a hand over his face. "The truth is, after Dad died, I felt like I lost you too. You just closed up, went quiet, stopped calling as much, stopped asking about the kids. and I didn't know how to reach you, so I just stopped trying. And then I got angry instead, because it hurt less than feeling forgotten." His voice cracked on the last word, and Ruth felt her chest tighten like a fist closing around her heart. "I felt like I lost both of you," David went on, tears slipping down his face now, unashamed. "Dad in the ground and you somewhere I couldn't find, and I didn't know how to say that without sounding like a kid whining that his mom didn't love him enough. So I just stayed away, told myself it was easier." Ruth reached over and took his hand, holding it tight between both of hers. "David," she said, her own voice thick, "I never stopped loving you. Not for one single day." He looked at her, eyes red, waiting. "When your father died," she said slowly, "something in me just went dark. I didn't know how to be a whole person anymore, let alone a mother who called every Sunday and asked the right questions. I was drowning, David. And I didn't know how to drown out loud in front of you, so I did it quiet. I thought I was protecting you from it. I didn't understand that my quiet felt like me leaving you too. I thought you didn't need me anymore," David whispered. "Oh, honey." Ruth's tears spilled over now, and she reached up to cup his face the way she used to when he'd skinned his knee as a boy. "I have needed you every single day. I just forgot how to show it. Grief does that. It makes you stupid about the people you love most." David let out a broken laugh, half sob, and leaned into her hand. "I'm so sorry," he said. "For all of it. The lawyer, the threats, all of it. I was scared of losing you, and I went about it all wrong." "You were scared because you love me," Ruth said. "That's not something to be sorry for." She pulled him into her arms then, and he came easily, folding down into her shoulder the way he had as a small boy after a nightmare. And Ruth held him tight, rocking gently, whispering into his hair. "I've got you," she said again. The same words from the dance floor, but different now, deeper. "And I'm not going anywhere, not again. We start now, David. You and me. We build this back, together." "Together," David repeated, voice muffled against her shoulder, and for the first time in years, Ruth felt her son truly home. The road home was dark, just the two thin beams of Ruth's headlights cutting through the night. She drove slow, the way she always did after dark, humming a little tune under her breath. Her whole body felt warm and worn out, the good kind of tired that came from dancing and laughing and holding her son again after so many years apart. She thought about David's face when he'd hugged her. She thought about Jax standing near the punch table, watching over her like some kind of quiet guardian. She thought about the string lights swaying over the crowd and how full her heart felt, fuller than it had in years. Then, without warning, a pain shot through her head. It was sharp, sudden, like something inside her skull had cracked open. Ruth gasped, and her hands jerked on the wheel. The truck swerved, tires humming against the gravel shoulder before she managed to pull it straight again. "Lord," she whispered, blinking hard. The world tilted sideways. The road in front of her doubled, then blurred, the white lines smearing into streaks of light. Her left hand went numb, fingers curling stiff against the steering wheel like she no longer owned them. Ruth's foot found the brake, though it felt far away, like she was pressing it through water. The truck rolled to a slow stop on the shoulder of the road, gravel crunching under the tires. She threw it into park with a hand that barely obeyed her, some deep old instinct guiding her even as her mind grew foggy and slow. "Not yet," she muttered, though she wasn't sure who she was talking to. "Not yet." Her vision narrowed, like she was looking down a long tunnel. The dashboard lights blurred into a soft, yellow glow. She thought of David's face again, and Jax's steady eyes, and for one strange, peaceful moment, she wasn't afraid. Then everything went dark. Sam Whitfield almost didn't notice the truck. He was driving home from his shift at the feed store, tired, radio playing low, when his headlights caught the shape of Ruth's old pickup sitting crooked on the shoulder, engine still running, brake lights glowing red in the dark. He knew that truck. Everybody in Miller's Creek knew that truck. Sam slowed and pulled up behind it, heart already starting to pound before he even stepped out. He walked up to the driver's side window, tapping on the glass. "Ruth, you all right?" No answer. He tapped harder, and that's when he saw her, slumped against the seatbelt, head tilted at a wrong, boneless angle, mouth slightly open. "Ruth!" He yanked the door open, hands shaking, fumbling for his phone in his back pocket. "Ruth, can you hear me? Ruth!" Her chest was moving, thank God, rising and falling in shallow little breaths, but her skin looked pale and clammy in the glow of his phone's flashlight. Sam's fingers trembled as he dialed 911, the words tumbling out of him too fast. "I need an ambulance. There's a woman. She's unconscious. I think it's her heart or something. Please, hurry. It's Ruth Callahan. Everybody knows her. Please hurry." The phone rang in Jax's pocket while he was helping Deacon load folding chairs into the back of a truck at the fairground. He almost didn't answer until he saw the county sheriff's name flash on the screen. By the time he hung up, his face had gone the color of ash. "It's Ruth," he said, voice tight. "They're taking her to the hospital. Something's wrong." Deacon didn't ask questions. He just dropped the chair he was holding and ran for the truck. Milo got the call from Deacon while he was still helping a little girl climb off her dirt bike near the edge of the field. He barely remembered to tell her goodbye before he was sprinting toward his motorcycle, hands shaking so bad he nearly dropped his keys twice. David was halfway home, windows down, still smiling from the night, when his phone rang. Sam's voice on the other end was frantic, words tumbling over each other. David's stomach dropped straight through the floor of the car. He turned the wheel hard, tires screeching as he spun the car around, foot slamming the gas pedal to the floor. They arrived within minutes of each other, tearing into the hospital parking lot from different directions, faces pale, chests heaving. Jax, Deacon, Milo, David. They found each other in the waiting room, none of them speaking, all of them wearing the same look of raw, helpless fear. Through the double doors, they caught one last glimpse of Ruth being wheeled away on a stretcher, doctors shouting orders, a nurse pressing something to her arm. Then the doors swung shut, and all four men stood frozen, waiting, praying for any word at all. The waiting room smelled like coffee and bleach. Four men sat in plastic chairs bolted to the floor, none of them talking, all of them staring at the same spot on the tile. Jax had his elbows on his knees, hands clasped so tight his knuckles had gone white. His leather vest still smelled like the fairground, like grass and smoke and string lights. He kept thinking about how Ruth had looked dancing under those lights just hours ago, laughing so hard she had to hold on to David's arm to stay standing. Now David sat 2 chairs down, staring at his shoes, his tie from the festival still loose around his neck. He hadn't said a word since he walked through the doors. His hands shook a little every few minutes, and each time he'd press them flat against his thighs like he was trying to make them stop. Deacon stood by the window, arms crossed, looking out at the parking lot lights. He hadn't sat down once. Every so often he'd glance at the clock on the wall, then look away like it made him sick to watch the minutes crawl by. Milo was the only one still moving, pacing a slow line across the waiting room carpet, back and forth, his boots squeaking faintly on the floor. "They gotta tell us something soon," Milo muttered. mostly to himself. "It's been almost 2 hours." Nobody answered him. There wasn't anything to say. A nurse walked past the doorway, and all 4 men sat up straighter, hope flashing across their faces. But she didn't stop. She didn't even look their way. She just kept walking, clipboard in hand, and the hope drained right back out of them. Jax closed his eyes. He thought about the night Ruth had cut the chains off his wrists, how she hadn't even hesitated, how she'd looked at him like he was already somebody worth saving. He thought about every supper since then, every time she'd fussed over him like he was one of her own boys. "She's tougher than all of us," Jax said quietly, not really to anyone. "She'll fight." David looked up at him then, eyes red-rimmed. "She better." It was the first thing he'd said in an hour, and it hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Deacon finally sat down, dropping into the chair beside David like his legs had given out. "You remember," he said, voice low, "how she used to yell at us for tracking mud through her kitchen? Even after everything we'd been through, she'd still fuss about mud." A small, broken laugh came out of Milo. "She hit me with a dish towel once. Actually hit me. 45 years old and she still made me feel like a kid getting scolded." Nobody laughed long. The memory faded fast, swallowed up by the fear pressing down on all of them. Time moved strange in that waiting room. Minutes felt like hours. The vending machine hummed in the corner. Someone's phone buzzed and got silenced. A janitor mopped the same stretch of floor twice, like even he didn't know what else to do with himself. Around 3 a.m, David finally spoke again. "I never told her I was proud of her," he said, staring at the floor. "Not once, not even tonight." Jax didn't say anything right away. Then, quietly, "She knew, David. Trust me. She knew." The night stretched on. Doctors moved in and out through the double doors, but none of them stopped to talk. Nurses hurried past with charts and machines, their faces unreadable. Every time footsteps came near, all 4 men held their breath. Every time they passed by, the silence crashed back down heavier than before. Somewhere around 5, the sky outside the window started to turn a pale gray, the first hint of dawn creeping over the parking lot. Milo had finally stopped pacing and sat slumped in a chair, his head in his hands. Deacon stared blankly at the wall. David and Jax sat side by side now, not speaking, just waiting. 2 men who never thought they'd be sitting together like this, bound now by the same fear. Then, finally, the double doors opened. A doctor stepped through, mask pulled down around his neck, his face tired and lined with the kind of exhaustion that came from a long, hard night. All 4 men stood up at once. The doctor's words were careful, measured. "She's stable. The stroke was serious, but she's fighting. We won't know more until she wakes up." It wasn't good news, but it wasn't the worst news either. All 4 men breathed for what felt like the first time in hours. They were allowed in 2 at a time, and after that, the days folded into each other, marked only by the soft beep of machines and the rotation of tired men in and out of a small hospital room. Jax took the first night shift alone. He sat in the plastic chair beside her bed, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, the tube taped beneath her nose, the IV line running into the back of her hand. Her hand looked so small against the white blanket. He remembered that same hand gripping bolt cutters like she'd done it 100 times before, snapping the chain off his wrist without so much as a flinch. "You didn't even ask my name first," he said quietly, more to fill the silence than anything. "Just cut the chains and told me to get inside before the truck came back." He shook his head, a tired smile pulling at his mouth. I've had men point guns at me and flinch less than you did that night, Ruth. And you didn't flinch at all." He reached over, careful, and set his rough hand over hers. "I never had anybody do something like that for me. Not once. Not till you." His voice caught, just barely. "You gotta wake up so I can tell you that properly." Deacon took the next shift, bringing a small deck of cards he never got around to playing. Instead, he just talked, low and steady, the way he always did. He told her about his daughter, about the birthday he missed 3 years back, about how he'd started writing letters he never sent because he didn't know how to say sorry after so much time had passed. "You'd probably tell me to just pick up the phone," he said, almost laughing. "Simple as that. Everything's simple to you, Ruth. Wish it was that simple for the rest of us." Milo's shifts were the loudest, even though he tried to keep his voice down. He told her about the dirt bikes, about how her grandkids were getting braver every day, about how the youngest one, Emma, had asked when Grandma's biker boys would take her camping. "I told her soon," Milo said, chewing his lip. "You gotta wake up, so that's not a lie." David's shifts were quieter. He mostly just sat, staring at his mother's face, tracing the lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when he was a boy. Sometimes he talked. Sometimes he just held her hand and let the guilt sit heavy in his chest. Unspoken. The nurses started to recognize them. The leather vests and the business suit taking turns at the same bedside. An odd family formed out of chains and grief and love nobody expected. It was late on the 4th night when David walked in and found Jax sitting alone again, head bowed, Ruth's hand still resting in his. David stood in the doorway for a moment before he spoke. "Can I come in?" Jax looked up, surprised, then nodded, shifting slightly like he might get up and give David space. David waved him back down. "No, stay," David said. He pulled the second chair closer, sitting down across from him, the bed and Ruth's still form between them. For a while, neither man spoke. Then David cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology," he said. "When I first came to town, I thought you were dangerous. I thought my mother had lost her mind letting you into her house, her life." He paused, looking down at his hands. "But I was wrong. You've been more patient with her, more present, than I have been in years. You sat with her. You showed up. I didn't, not for a long time." Jax didn't say anything at first, just studied David carefully, like he was trying to make sure the words were real. "You're here now," Jax said finally. "That's what matters to her. That's all she ever wanted." David nodded slowly, throat tight. "I know, but I wanted you to hear it from me, that I was wrong about you, that I'm grateful for everything you did for her, even before I understood what you were doing." Jax stood, and so did David, and for a moment they just looked at each other across Ruth's bed, two men who had started this journey as strangers, then adversaries, and now stood as something else entirely. Jax reached out his hand. David took it, gripping firm. "Equals," Jax said quietly. "Equals," David repeated. The handshake between David and Jax had barely broken when the machines beside the bed made a small, different sound. Not an alarm, just a shift in rhythm, like the room itself had taken a breath. David felt it before he understood it. Ruth's fingers twitched against the white blanket. "Jax," David whispered, his eyes locked on his mother's face. Jax turned back fast, already leaning over the bed rail. "Ruth!" Her eyelids fluttered, fighting against something heavy, like she was pulling herself up from underwater. A long moment passed where nothing happened, and David's heart clenched, afraid he'd imagined it. Then her eyes opened, just barely, just a sliver of blue peeking through. "Get the others," Jax said, not taking his eyes off her. Now. David was already moving, sticking his head into the hallway, calling for Deacon and Milo, who had been dozing in the waiting room chairs down the corridor. They came at a run, boots pounding against the tile floor, and burst through the door just as Ruth's eyes opened fully. She was pale, weaker than any of them had ever seen her. But she was awake, and her eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in each face like she was counting them, making sure they were all really there. "There you are," she whispered. Her voice was thin, cracked from days of silence, but it was hers. It was Ruth. Milo made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and pressed his hand against his mouth. Deacon's eyes went glassy immediately, and he had to look away for a second, blinking hard. David gripped the bed rail so tight his knuckles went white, tears already sliding down his face without shame. "Mama," he said, and it came out smaller than he meant it to, like he was 7 years old again. "I'm here," Ruth said. "Still here." Jax leaned in close, his big hand still wrapped carefully around hers. "You scared us half to death, old woman," he said, voice rough. A faint smile pulled at the corner of Ruth's mouth. "Good," she whispered. "Means you were paying attention." They all laughed then, a shaky, relieved sound, tears and laughter tangled together the way they get when fear finally lets go of a room. Ruth's eyes moved over each of them again, slower this time, like she was memorizing them. The nurses would come soon, would want to check on her, run their tests. But for now it was just the 5 of them, and she seemed to know that this moment mattered more than any machine could measure. "Listen to me," she said, and though her voice was weak, something steady moved underneath it, the same steadiness that had once picked up bolt cutters without a second thought. "I need you all to hear this." "We're listening, Ma," David said, his hand finding Jax's shoulder without thinking, the 2 of them standing close now, no space left between them. Ruth took a slow breath, gathering what strength she had. "Family," she said, "was never about blood. I used to think it was. Used to think that's all it could be." Her eyes found David's. "I was wrong about that, and I'm sorry it took me so long to understand it." She turned her gaze to Jax next. "Family is about who shows up." Her fingers tightened weakly around his hand. "Who shows up with bolt cutters when life's got you chained down and bleeding and you don't think anybody's coming?" Her eyes moved to Deacon. "Deacon," she said softly, "you show up every single day, even when nobody's watching. That's rare in this world. Don't ever stop." Then to Milo, whose eyes were already spilling over. "Milo, you brought light into this house. Don't you dare let anybody dim it, you hear me?" Finally, her eyes settled on David, and her hand reached for his, weak but certain. "And you came back," she said. "That's all I ever wanted, just for you to come back." David pressed his forehead against her hand, unable to speak. "You're all my sons," Ruth whispered, her eyes growing heavy again, the effort of speaking pulling at what little strength she had left. "Every one of you. Don't you forget that." Her eyes fluttered, fighting to stay open, but sleep was pulling at her now, gentle and inevitable. "Rest, Ma," David whispered. "We'll be here." And with her sons around her, Ruth Callahan closed her eyes and drifted back into peaceful sleep. The hours after Ruth fell back asleep passed slow and quiet. Nobody left the room. David sat in the chair closest to the bed, his mother's hand still resting in his. Jax stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the parking lot lights flicker against the dark glass. Deacon had pulled a chair next to Milo, and the 2 of them sat shoulder to shoulder, not talking, just waiting the way men do when words feel too small for what's happening. Around midnight, The machine beside Ruth's bed changed its rhythm again. This time it wasn't a small shift. The beeping slowed, then slowed some more, dragging out longer between each sound. David's head snapped up. "Something's wrong." Jax was already moving toward the door. "I'll get the nurse." He didn't have to go far. A nurse named Carol, the same one who had checked on Ruth every few hours since she'd been admitted, stepped inside almost as soon as Jax opened the door, like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. She moved to the monitor, her eyes scanning the numbers, her face calm, but careful in the way of someone who has done this before, and knows how to hold steady for the people who haven't. She checked Ruth's pulse, checked her breathing. Then she looked up at the 4 men crowded into the small room, and there was something gentle and sorry in her expression that told them everything before she said a word. "I think it's time to call whoever needs to be here," Carol said softly. "It won't be long now." Nobody needed to be told twice. There was nobody else to call. They were already here. Milo made a small, broken sound and pressed his hand over his mouth again, the same way he had hours earlier, except this time there was no laughter mixed in with it. Deacon reached over and gripped his shoulder, steadying him, even though his own eyes were wet. David leaned close to the bed, brushing his mother's hair back from her forehead, the way she used to do for him when he was small and sick with fever. "Mama," he whispered. "We're here, all of us." Ruth's eyes opened just a little, just enough to find him. She didn't try to speak this time. She didn't need to. Her hand moved slightly in his, a small squeeze, weak but sure, and David felt his chest crack open with the weight of it. Jax came to stand at the foot of the bed, one hand resting on the metal rail. "You did good, Ruth," he said, voice rough and low. "You did real good." Deacon stepped closer too, resting his hand gently over her ankle through the blanket, the same careful way he touched things he was fixing, things he wanted to last. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." Milo wiped his face with the back of his hand and moved to the other side of the bed, taking her free hand in both of his. "You gave me a family," he said, his voice cracking on the last word. "I never had one before you." Ruth's eyes moved slowly across each of them one more time, the same way she had earlier, like she was holding on to the sight of them, keeping it somewhere safe. Her lips moved, just barely, the ghost of a smile settling there. The machine kept slowing. The gaps between each beep stretched longer and longer, the room growing quieter with each one, until the sound felt like something fading into the distance, rather than something happening right beside them. David held her hand tight, tears falling freely now, not caring who saw. Jax's jaw was tight, his eyes glassy but steady, holding it together for the room the way he always did. Deacon bowed his head, and Milo pressed his forehead gently against the back of Ruth's hand, his shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Outside, the hallway was silent. No footsteps, no chatter, no distant hum of hospital business. It felt like the whole building had gone still, holding its breath for them. The beeping slowed once more, softer now, further apart, until there was one last small sound, and then nothing. The room fell into silence. Ruth Callahan was gone, surrounded by every son she had ever called her own, the ones she carried and the ones she chose, all of them together in the quiet dark, holding on to her until the very last moment and beyond. The office of Miller's Creek's only lawyer sat above the old bank building downtown, up a narrow staircase that creaked with every step. David had been there once before, years ago, when his father's will had been read. He remembered the smell of the place, old paper and pipe smoke, And how small the room felt, even though it wasn't small at all. Jax, Deacon, and Milo had never been inside a lawyer's office in their lives. Not for anything good, anyway. They sat stiff in their chairs, looking like men waiting for bad news, their big hands folded in their laps like they didn't know what to do with them. The lawyer, a thin, older man named Mr. Pruitt, with round glasses and a slow, careful way of talking, shuffled a stack of papers in front of him. He looked at the four of them over the top of his glasses, one at a time, like he was trying to memorize their faces. "I want to say," he began, "that in 40 years of doing this work, I have never read a will quite like this one." Nobody said anything. David shifted in his seat. Jax's jaw tightened. Mr. Pruitt cleared his throat and looked down at the papers. "Ruth came to see me about 6 years ago. Told me she needed to update some things. I remember it clear because she brought 3 men with her that day, sat them right out in the hallway, and told me she had some sons to add to her paperwork." Milo's head came up sharp. 6 years ago?" "That's right," Mr. Pruitt said. "Near as I can figure, that would have been about a week after she found the 3 of you." He glanced at Jax, Deacon, and Milo. "Chained up, was it? That's the story that went around town anyway." Deacon's throat worked like he was trying to swallow something too big to go down easy. Mr. Pruitt slid his glasses up his nose and kept reading. "Ruth Callahan, being of sound mind, hereby declares the following as her legal sons, entitled to all rights and considerations thereof, alongside her natural-born son, David Callahan." He looked up. "Then she lists your names: Jax Coleman, Deacon Ward, Milo Sutter." The room went dead silent. David stared at the lawyer like the words hadn't quite landed yet. "She put them in her will? Back then? Before any of this? Before the town knew them? Before I knew them?" "She did," Mr. Pruitt said gently. "Said she wasn't waiting around for the world to catch up to what she already knew in her heart." Jax's hand came up to cover his mouth. He didn't say anything. Couldn't, maybe. Mr. Pruitt continued, his voice steady but soft now, like he understood the weight of what he was carrying. "As for the specifics of the estate, the house goes to David, along with her personal savings and her husband's old truck, which she specifically noted David always loved as a boy." David's eyes stung. He hadn't thought about that truck in years. "And the hardware store," Mr. Pruitt said, setting the paper down and folding his hands on top of it, "goes jointly to all 4 of you. Equal ownership, equal say. She wrote here that none of you were to run it alone, that it only worked if all 4 of you were in it together, same as she found you." Nobody spoke. The old clock on the wall ticked loud in the quiet room. Milo was the first to break, a small, choked sound escaping him before he could stop it. He pressed a fist to his mouth, shoulders shaking. Deacon reached over without a word and gripped his shoulder, though his own eyes were shining wet. Jax stared straight ahead at nothing, his jaw working, fighting something back that looked too big for even a man like him to hold. David sat frozen, his mind turning over everything, the timeline of it hitting him harder than he expected. 6 years. She had put their names down 6 years ago, back when they were still strangers to him, back before any of this made sense to anyone else in the world. She'd known. She'd already decided. While David had been distant, resentful, holding his mother at arm's length, she had been quietly building this family, writing them into her life on paper long before anyone understood what she was doing. "She really believed in us," Milo finally managed, his voice cracking on every word. "Before we even believed in ourselves." Mr. Pruitt took off his glasses and set them on the desk, giving the 4 men a moment they clearly needed. Nobody in the room moved to fill the silence. It sat there, heavy and full, the kind of silence that comes when grief and love get so tangled together there's nothing left to say out loud. The next few days moved slow and fast at the same time. Slow, because grief has a way of stretching every hour out long and thin. Fast, because there was so much to do, and not enough hands to do it, even with 4 of them working together now instead of 1 woman working alone. Deacon handled the flowers, driving all the way to the next county to find a shop that could get enough on short notice. Milo took care of calling the church, sitting on the phone with the pastor for near an hour, working out times and seating and how many folding chairs they could borrow from the fire station. David dealt with the paperwork, the death certificate, the notices, the things nobody wants to think about, but somebody has to. Jax handled the truck. He drove into town that first morning after the will reading, down to the little newspaper office where a young reporter named Casey Nguyen worked the desk most days. The only reporter Millers Creek had left since the bigger papers stopped caring about small towns years back. Casey had written a piece on Ruth back when the story first broke, back when 200 bikes showed up outside the hardware store, and the whole town buzzed about it for weeks. "She passed," Jax told her, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, looking nothing like the man who'd once scared half the county just by walking into a room. "Thought you'd want to know. Thought maybe you'd want to write something." Casey's eyes went soft and sad, and she asked him to sit down, and he told her everything. Start to finish, the chains and the bolt cutters and the pot roast and the will. By the next morning, the story ran not just in the local paper, but picked up by a wire service out of the city. And from there, it went further than anyone in Millers Creek could have guessed. It started with a comment on a biker forum. Somebody who knew somebody who'd ridden through Millers Creek that first day, back when 200 bikes had lined up outside Callahan's Hardware. Then it was a post on a Facebook page for East Coast riders, then a share, then 100 shares. Then the story wasn't just local news anymore. It was everywhere. The grandmother who freed 3 chained Hell's Angels with a pair of bolt cutters. The grandmother who fed them pot roast and asked for nothing but Sunday supper. The grandmother who left them her shop. Jax's phone started ringing that Thursday afternoon, 3 days before the funeral was set to happen. He didn't recognize the number, but he answered anyway, same as he always did. "Is this Jax Coleman?" The voice on the other end was gravelly, older, careful. "This is Big Tom Reyes out of the Sacramento chapter. Heard about your mother. Wanted to know when the service is." Jax blinked, sitting down slow on the porch step outside Ruth's house, the house that would always be Ruth's house no matter whose name was on the deed. "Sunday," he said. 2 o'clock. Millers Creek Baptist, then out to the cemetery after. "We'll be there," Big Tom said, like it was the simplest thing in the world. "Bringing about 40 riders. That all right?" "That's..." Jax cleared his throat. "That's fine. Yeah, come on out." He'd barely hung up when the phone rang again. This time it was a chapter out of Ohio, then Texas. Then a woman calling from a small club in Georgia that Jax had never even heard of, saying they'd read the story and wanted to pay their respects, that Ruth Callahan sounded like the kind of woman the world didn't make anymore. By Friday morning, Jax had lost count of the calls. Chapter. Presidents from states he'd never ridden through, men and women he'd never met, all asking the same question. "When's the funeral? What time? Where do we line up? Where do we?" He sat on the porch with the phone in his lap, the morning sun cutting long shadows across the yard, and he thought about the woman who'd opened her back door in a thunderstorm to 3 strangers in chains, who'd never asked for anything back, who just wanted them to stop by for supper sometimes. He thought about how something that small, one woman's kindness in a hardware store in a town most people had never heard of, could ripple out so far and reach so many. It didn't seem right that something so quiet could grow so loud. But it had. And it kept growing, call after call, chapter after chapter, until Jax finally understood that Ruth Callahan's love hadn't just changed 4 men's lives. It had changed something bigger than that, something he didn't have words for yet. Sunday morning came gray and soft, fog sitting low over Miller's Creek like a blanket somebody forgot to pull back. David woke before dawn, unable to sleep more than a few hours at a time since the hospital, and he stood at the window of his mother's house, looking out at a sky that hadn't decided yet what kind of day it wanted to be. Then he heard it. A sound like far-off thunder, low and steady, rolling in from the highway. He walked out onto the porch in his socks, the wood cold under his feet, and what he saw made him forget the cold entirely. The highway that ran through Miller's Creek, the same highway his mother's shop had sat beside for 40 years, was lined with motorcycles as far as he could see in both directions. Headlights cut through the fog like a string of pearls stretching toward the horizon. They must have ridden through the night, some of them for days, chapter after chapter, state after state, all converging on this one small town that most of them had never heard of a month ago. Jax came out behind him, still buttoning his shirt, and stopped cold at the sight. "Lord have mercy," he said quietly. Deacon and Milo joined them on the porch, and the 4 men stood there in silence, watching the lines of bikes grow longer as more arrived, engines idling low, riders standing beside their machines in respectful quiet, waiting. By 9 o'clock, the police chief himself had come by to say he'd never seen anything like it, not in 30 years on the force. He'd had to call in help from 2 neighboring counties just to manage the traffic, and even then, cars were backed up for miles trying to get through town. "How many you figure?" David asked, his voice hushed like he was in church already. "Word from the road captains is somewhere around 2,000, Jax said. "Give or take." 2,000. David let the number settle into him. 2,000 strangers who'd never met his mother, who only knew her through a story passed hand to hand, screen to screen. And yet here they were, engines silent now, hats off, waiting for a widow from a hardware store to be laid to rest. The church could only hold 200 people, and it filled fast. Riders in leather vests standing shoulder to shoulder with the townsfolk who'd known Ruth her whole life, the grocer and the postman and the woman who ran the diner where Ruth had eaten breakfast every Tuesday for 30 years. The rest stood outside in the fog, heads bowed, listening through the open doors and windows as the pastor spoke about a woman who'd seen sons where the world saw outlaws, who'd never once asked what a person had done before deciding whether they deserved kindness. David spoke, too, though his voice shook the whole way through. He talked about the mother he'd pushed away and the mother who'd never stopped waiting for him to come back. He talked about bolt cutters and pot roast and a woman too stubborn to be afraid of anything, even dying. When it was over, when the last hymn had faded and the pastor had said his final words, 6 men carried Ruth's casket down the church steps toward the waiting hearse. David walked at the front corner, and beside him walked Jax, and behind them came Deacon and Milo, all 4 of them moving slow and steady, matching their steps like they'd practiced it, though they hadn't. The riders who'd been standing outside parted to let them through, forming a corridor of leather and silence that stretched all the way to the road. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. As the casket reached the hearse, and the pallbearers set it down gentle as they could manage, one rider near the front raised his fist into the air. It was a signal, though David didn't know that yet, didn't know what was coming. Then the first engine roared to life, and then another. And then it wasn't 1 or 2, but hundreds, then more than 1,000, then all 2,000 engines firing together in a wave that rolled down the length of the highway like something alive, like the earth itself was clearing its throat to say goodbye. The sound was enormous, thunderous, shaking the windows of the church behind them, and David felt it in his chest, in his teeth, in the soles of his feet through the pavement. He looked at Jax, and Jax looked back at him, and neither one of them tried to hide the tears running down their faces. Behind them, Deacon and Milo stood with their heads bowed, hands over their hearts, as 2,000 strangers gave Ruth Callahan the loudest, most thunderous goodbye Millers Creek had ever seen. Spring came late to Millers Creek that year, but when it finally arrived, it came all at once. Green pushed up through the brown grass almost overnight, and the air smelled like rain and warm dirt, and the highway that had once carried 2,000 motorcycles now carried the ordinary sound of morning traffic again. Callahan's hardware had been closed for 6 months. The windows had gone dusty. Weeds had crept up through the cracks in the parking lot. But on the first Saturday in April, the doors opened wide, and a new sign hung above the porch, painted in careful letters by Deacon's steady hand. Ruth's house. All family welcome. David stood on the sidewalk that morning with his hands in his pockets, looking up at the sign like he still couldn't quite believe it was real. Jax stood beside him, arms crossed, and Deacon and Milo were already inside, moving boxes, calling out to each other about where the nails should go and whether the paint had dried on the back shelf. "She would have liked that sign," David said. "She would have made us redo the lettering 3 times, Jax said. "Told us it wasn't straight." David laughed, and it came easy now, the way it hadn't come easy in a long time. 6 months of grief had worn the sharp edges off him. He wasn't the same man who'd stormed into town that first year, furious and afraid, trying to save his mother from a life he didn't understand. He'd learned things since then. He'd learned that family wasn't a thing you were born into and stuck with. It was a thing you built, plank by plank, the same way his mother had built her whole life out of an old hardware store and a heart too big for her own good. The will had split the store evenly, 4 ways, and at first David had wondered if it would tear them apart, all of them fighting over floor space and inventory and who got the final say. But it hadn't worked that way. Jax handled the ordering and the business side, steady and sharp the way he'd always been. Deacon fixed everything that broke, which in an old building was more than anybody expected. Milo ran the register and talked to every customer like they were old friends, which most of them became. And David, who used to sit behind a desk in the city doing work that never touched another human being, found himself teaching Saturday classes on basic home repair to anyone who wandered in, kids and retirees alike, and discovered he loved it more than any job he'd ever had. They didn't always agree. Deacon and Jax had gotten into a real argument over paint colors that had taken Milo laughing to break up. David and Jax had gone back and forth for a week about whether to keep the old cash register or bring in something modern. But the arguments never lasted because underneath all of it was the thing Ruth had given them, the thing none of them wanted to lose. By afternoon, the store had settled into its rhythm, customers coming and going, the bell over the door ringing steady, and David stepped out back where his children were playing in the yard his mother used to keep so carefully. His daughter Emma sat on a small dirt bike, wobbling but grinning, while Milo jogged alongside her with one hand hovering near the handlebars, ready to catch her if she tipped. His son Tommy was already ahead of her, pedaling hard down the worn path Deacon had mowed special for them, laughing so loud it carried clear across the yard. "Slow down! You're gonna eat dirt!" Deacon called after him, though he was grinning too wide to mean it as a warning. David watched them for a moment, his chest tight in the good way, the way that used to scare him because he didn't know what to do with feelings that big. Now he just let it sit there. He grabbed 2 mugs of coffee from the pot inside and carried them out to the porch, where Jax was already sitting on the steps, looking out at the same yard, the same laughing children, the same green grass that used to be nothing but a place where 3 chained men had once been dragged to safety. David sat down beside him and handed him a mug. "Thanks," Jax said. They didn't say much else. They didn't need to. The coffee was warm, the sun was breaking through the last of the morning fog, and somewhere behind them the bell over the shop door rang again. Another customer walking into Ruth's house, where nobody ever had to ask what you'd done to deserve a welcome. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story, and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.